Oh no! Yes.
I'm not doing any. And I don't have any.
Yeah, I think people will sign in online too. Couple minutes. Okay, hi everyone. We're gonna get started. I'm Ro. I'm responsible for the controls team, and I'm joined here by Sally, who's responsible for the legal team. We've worked very closely over the past several months to streamline some of the contract management and approval processes for getting funding and executing contracts and making sure our vendors get paid. And there's definitely things that are going really well and areas for further improvement. So I'll let you chime in a little bit more there.
So I just want to say hi. The DevCo team has been growing a lot. So I know some of you may have heard of my name, but not really necessarily met me in person or have had me on GVCs, but I just want to say hi. You'll see later in the slides, I think there's been a lot of talk, but I just want to confirm that there is in the works right now, we're in third rounds of hiring. So there will be another legal team member. We refer to them as LTMs. There will be another legal team member that will be joining, hopefully within the next month to 2 months, including onboarding and then joining. And the plan is for that lawyer to only be supporting the DevCo team. So we'll not do transactional management stuff. We'll only be supporting DevCo. So that's going to be great because I apologize to a lot of you where I'm kind of doing catch as catch can on the different districts, especially Project Spartan, spending more time with Spartan, but not that much, only because there are other ground up development projects that are not being handled by Joe Vivi's team that are happening outside of the state of California. And those projects I am on as well. So hopefully going forward, you guys will get better support, better visibility, and much more face time with the immediate Google legal team. But you guys, I know, have been having a lot of exposure to the Allen Matkins outside counsel firm that we rely on. So, hello.
Great. So today we're going to cover a range of topics. First, Sally and I'll introduce our teams, and then we'll go over really how to get funding at Google and the various thresholds of funding approvals. Matt will go over the go to build process that we developed this past quarter. And then also how to request funding for your projects after whether it's the Dave Radcliffe threshold is approved or the Spend Authority Committee or the board. And then we'll have Chi come up along with the Allen Matkins team to go over the legal intake process. And so as Sally mentioned, her group oversees all real estate at Google. And so that's not just DevCo projects. It's not just Ruse TI Bay Area. It's global plus data centers and transactions. So it's a very broad and deep expertise that she has that her and Molly oversee. And so being able to streamline some of our intakes that we get that we send to her team is really critical for us to be successful and to make sure that our contracts are executed properly. And then Katie on our controls group will come and look at the contract lifecycle, just so you guys have visibility into the ins and outs of what a contract is, what is necessary to execute a contract, and make sure our vendors, number one is making sure our vendors get paid, and expedite that as much as possible. So having a better understanding of that life cycle will help with that. Then we'll take a 10-minute break, and then we'll go through legal recommendations. So Sally's team will come up and look through various risks within the contract, communication sharing docs, and we'll have Q&A set up. The last 30 minutes we'll have Q&A. That said, each section of those, so A, B, C, D through F, will have an area called takeaways. And so we'll have 5 minutes at the takeaways to take any questions, but we'll be monitoring that. And if it's over 5 minutes, we ask you to wait to the 30-minute mark to bring up those questions again. So team introductions. Hi, I'm Ro. John and I oversee the controls program with Chi, and we have project support for contract execution led by Katie on the T&T team, and Gareth, who oversees some of the business controls to making sure we get the right information early on. And then you have project-specific points of contacts that are your go-to person. So on Charleston East, for instance, you have Jen to escalate anything to help you through that process of executing a contract, getting invoices reviewed, and so forth. And then on the district side, we have Matt as the lead with Dimitri as his support.
So hi, I'm Sally again. Molly Novi, for those of you who haven't worked with Molly, she's right here. And then outside counsel, we've got Gary McKitterick. And then we've got Derek Weisbender. And then another TBA, which I'm sure you will meet him or her shortly.
Great. So just to be clear, what's in scope for this meeting today, all DevCo ground up projects and master planning scopes that need to go through contractual processing will be covered today, as well as OpEx. So any funding that we're going to get approved through an operational expense, not capitally expensed, we'll discuss that as well. What's not in scope for today is specifically anything that's managed by CBRE. So right now we have the legal intake process for the infrastructure and transportation and MFA, but some of the processes aren't as in depth as the ground up projects and master planning. So now I'm going to hand it over to Matt to go over the spend and funding hierarchy. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. Okay, so as we know, DevCo's program is growing particularly quickly. Lots of things kicking off all the time. So what we've tried to do is put in a couple of processes to make life a bit easier and streamline some of those various different funding approval mechanisms that we need to go through. Try and make that process really clear, really easy, really well documented, and also give out the calendar. Thanks. But first, what we want to go through is the question we get asked most often is how we've got a vendor, we want to do some work, how do we make that happen? And there's a few steps that we need to do to make sure that's done in the correct way. First one, your project needs to have spend or funding approval. That is now done by the go to build mechanism, which includes the filtering for the SAC and AC bodies, depending on the funding amount that you're going for. As part of that, we also need to get a PFR, which is a project funding request, and that is the transaction on Pivot that basically releases the money to your F code so you can actually spend that money. Each vendor needs to have a master agreement in place. You don't need a master agreement per project, but you need a master agreement for that vendor that can be used across multiple projects. You might have some cases where a vendor does multiple types of services, so they might need multiple master agreements. That's going to be covered a little bit later on. Once that master agreement's in place, which sets out the overall terms for the engagement with the vendor, there's a specific contract and purchase order that are linked together, which deliver the scope of work effectively. What are the deliverables? What's the schedule? What's the cost? What does that fee structure look like? Then you can do some work. You can execute your work, and all those things need to be in place before that work commences. And then, you need to change work. You need to uplift POs. That follows the individual project change management process, which your PCMs can help you with. So go to build. As we mentioned earlier, there wasn't one clearly defined route prior to the end of last year where you could go for project funding and secure those budget and schedule baselines. So what we've done is try to standardize that and streamline it as far as possible. One set of templates, one document to submit to every single spend uplift and budget uplift that you're going for. We want to drive more efficient alignment across all project stakeholders. There's a lot of parties playing in DevCo. We need to make sure that everyone's got the information they need at the right time. We really wanted a clear, defined point to set those baselines for budget and schedule to make sure that we've got the right level of control on the program and to make sure that we're measuring things against the right points. We need to provide that assurance that project design objectives are going to meet the internal needs, the project's doing what it's supposed to do, and we're meeting our city obligations, and we understand how the projects are progressing. We also wanted to improve communications and make sure that we've got the right resources in place at the right time. GoToBuild allows us to do that whilst maintaining the capital delivery plan. So as we said, GoToBuild is DevCo's new stage gate approval process. It's applicable as of January 2019 to all capital projects and is required for any funding uplift, be that SAC, be that CEO approval, audit committee, or Dave Radcliffe's funding limit. It was drafted following the 2019 capital planning process that we went through last year to try and capture what projects were on deck, what was coming down the pipeline, and it lets us maintain that. So this is how the stage gates particularly apply to ground up projects. I'm using that as an example, but it does apply to all DevCo projects, including infrastructure and master planning projects. What's new with GoToBuild is having this initiation phase where you can have 150K for a seed funded project. What that lets you do before you've got a business case defined is engage some vendors without them having to work at risk. The district leads control that to control that spend, and it's managed through the master planning projects. Once you've developed that business case, you submit to Gate A, which is it's pre-charter. It's a really high level. What is the ROM budget? What's the schedule going to look like? What needs are we trying to meet? So you submit that to Gate A, and you get your funding limit roughly tied to Dave Radcliffe's approval up to 30 million, depending on the size of the project. Your project progresses through the life cycle and you get towards the end of your SDs. And bearing in mind that some projects might need to tweak this slightly, it's not a set framework that needs to be stick to rigidly. We can make adjustments as and when needed. So you've got to 100% SD. You want to go for your next round of funding. You'll probably go up to SAC, which is less than 150 million. So you'll submit a Gate B template through GoToBuild, and we'll make sure that those all tie in. So GoToBuild does the internal DevCo approval before we go to those higher approval bodies within Alphabet. Again, your project's progressing further. You're looking around an FGMP negotiation. You'll submit a Gate C document. So what are we asking for at each stage gate? So Gate A, we're basically saying you're okay to design. You've got a business case. You've got an outline schedule. We understand what that budget's going to look like. What we've also tried to do with GoToBuild is make sure that we've got the right project set up in place afterwards, after the stage gate's been approved. So at that point, you're going to get an F code, you're going to get your PFR, and you're going to get your PIMS project set up if it's applicable for the project that you're working on. Gate B, again, you've got that further level of documentation. So we're asking for roughly tied to the 100% SD milestone, that design documentation to be provided. We're asking for an entitlements and permitting or a community engagement strategy if that's applicable to your project. We're asking for a project schedule in more detail. It might be in Primavera P6, it might be Microsoft project. Again, you'll then give us the project charter, the risk register, cost books, everything that you've already got on your projects, but it's a way of capturing and providing that assurance that we know how the projects are progressing and we've got it captured at program level. Following that Gate B, you will get your budget and schedule baselines reset. So this is now the mechanism for setting all budget and schedule baselines across the program. Gate C is very similar. You're just at that later stage, and it will likely link to the audit committee requirements for your next round of funding for your FGMP. Everything is detailed in these templates. So it's one set of templates that you submit. It's via a form, and it's all captured and logged. It's a really easy process to submit. Very similar to how we used to submit GoToBat for the Gate A, B and C, but it's specific to DevCo and tweaked for our project requirements. So who is actually approving at GoToBuild? Well, your development executive should be effectively your proposer for your document. So what we're expecting to see when it gets to us as a program is that DE endorsement. They might be the one submitting it, they might not be, but they should have approved it internally before it ever gets to us. You might also consult various different people beforehand, and we've put on a list of suggested people, whether it's your director of district development, or it's your campus design director. You might consult the entitlements team. whoever needs to be consulted beforehand, they won't necessarily formally be captured because we've tried to keep it as lean as possible. So make sure you've got the right sign-offs and that you're detailing them in that go-to-build deck. Depending on the approval chain, it will then either go to John or Joe for sign-off, with DRS Finance being looped in as well. And then additionally, we will loop in anyone up to Dave Radcliffe effectively up to his level, depending on that spend request amount. So this is speaking more specifically about the project funding request process. And that is that transactional element that we need to use in Pivot to actually give the funds to the project. If it's in one of the earlier design stages, you'll get a PFR to match your full go-to-build level, your full budget submission that you're going for. If, for example, it's in construction, though, the finance team might choose to release that incrementally, at which point there's a separate deck that needs to be filled in, which is linked to here. It's just showing how you're drawing down that money, how you're using it, what's the plan in terms of cash flow and commitment flow. So, key takeaways. All spend and budget uplifts need to now follow the go-to-build procedure. Project cost and schedule baselines are now maintained solely via go-to-build. So that's the only way to update your project baseline. The central program controls team can provide guidance on which stage gates apply to existing projects. We're not going to create a load of work and ask people that are already in development projects way down the line to start doing gate A submissions again. There's no point, it adds no value. So reach out if you want to find out what your stage gate is and we can help with that. Project schedules really do need to account for the approvals calendar that's detailed on the go-to-build website. Made it really easy. You can go and attach it into your Google Calendar by clicking a button. All those dates are listed for all of 2019. So please make sure you understand when you can go for funding and how long it's going to take. We've just implemented, based on some feedback from the first couple of rounds, a new weekly email approval window. So rather than having to wait for that monthly in-person review, if you're going for a project that only needs up to that 30 million cap, we're now going to submit those weekly to try and maintain project progress. Any approval window exceptions outside of that will only be granted in extreme cases, so please make sure you're planning effectively for when you need to go for these funding commitments. All resources, templates, and an approval calendar are available at go-to-build, but other than that, I'm happy to answer any questions. Any questions? Yes. You'd know, so your seed funding is to enable the development of the business case. Basically, you have a discussion with the district lead that says, I want to use 150K to develop this business case and put it into gate A. You don't need to put a business case together to get your seed funding to then develop a business case. It's sort of the other way around. So not all projects that are developing a business case will actually need that seed funding. It's if, for example, you want to use some controls time that isn't covered elsewhere. If you might want to have a bit of development management time. It's if you might want to do some land surveys, whatever it might be, we can make sure it lets us transact it before we've got to that proper project approval. Okay. All right. Thank you, everyone. Sorry, Sally.
Behind, that really wasn't clear. Either a pre-construction agreement, a pre-plan agreement, or depending on what the services are, then you may need a beginning scoped ISA where the deliverable is truly a paper deliverable. And really what they're doing is giving you a service. They're consulting on something for you. You're not going to definitely rely on a design, for example. That's not pre-con.
Yeah.
I'm sorry. So hopefully that made sense. So when you go in and you need that pre-funding, we just need to make sure that any vendor who needs a pre-funding, that there is an agreement in place. So it's not just the ability to pay them, but there needs to be a contract as well, whether that's a pre-construction agreement, whether that's an ISA. So I just want to make sure that we're clear that pre-funding and contract go hand in hand.
So it works exactly the same way. And what we're doing is we're transacting it via the master planning projects. So it's on an F code, needs exactly the same requirements to cut a usual contract. Then once that's been approved at gate A, we move those purchase orders across onto that new project F code. So the exact same requirements still apply. We still use PIMs. It will just go through the master planning and project workflow. And so you will need a contract in place. Okay. Okay, great. Thank you, everyone. Yeah.
Hi everyone. I'm gonna go over the master agreement process with help from Derek as well. Um, so the reason that we've been starting, as Ro mentioned earlier, there's a lot of going on with the legal, and we got a lot of feedback, great feedback from Sally and Derek and Gary regarding like how we've been managing our master agreement request to date. A lot of it is ad hoc, inconsistent. As you said, know that Sally and her team manage real estate across TI and our DevCo, and the volume is huge, right? So it's not just coming our team. So we want to make sure that we're able to help them prioritize the workload, and information coming need to be in complete format in order for them to, uh, um, prepare an agreement in a timely manner. Because right now, the previously information has been provided piecemeal or is incorrect provided, and therefore it caused a lot of delay. And also for the master agreement requests, there's no centralized location for us to capture who requests when and how for which project and things like that. So we're now trying to centralize through the intake process, which I'm gonna walk through that in a little bit. Um, in terms of master agreement process, so this is the process that we currently put in place. One is you need to our PA team who will help you administer this process. They're gonna send you the legal intake questionnaire for the team to complete. The project development manager and the PCM team will help complete the questionnaire, and then submit it back to the PA team to do a final QA before it's submitted to the legal. The legal, once received the intake request, they're gonna draft the agreement based on the question that provide, and then once the draft agreement was sent out, the entire team will work on the negotiate T&Cs, and legal team will also provide the final agreement for execution. So this is before routing for signature. We're going to send all to the signature, so the vendor will sign, and then the Google manager will sign before it going out. And then once all the document size is being uploaded to our drive and share with the vendor directly. Um, in terms of the DocuSign, there's the TNT PA team will route that DocuSign master agreement once it finalized, and it's actually will go to the legal team to approve as a final approval. Go to the vendor and then development executive, and I said the depend on the signature amount of the contract or estimate contract, it's going to route to the appropriate director or VP level. I'm going to pass over to Derek. He's going to talk quickly about what the different type of master agreement that we have.
Sure. Hi, everyone. My name is Derek Weissman. I'm an attorney with Allen Matkins. You probably don't know my face, but you might know my email address. Probably worked with a bunch of you on contracts from time to time. But our firm is involved in a number of construction agreements and all the forms that we've listed up there. But just macro level, there's basically two categories. There's services agreements and there's construction agreements. The services agreements are broken down. There's a master consultant agreement, which has also the name Master Services Agreement, or MSA. I don't know why we don't call it an MCA, but we like MSA. And essentially anything's professional design, architectural, engineering, anything where there is a design deliverable. There's a development services agreement, also called project management services agreement. Any services that are related to what it says, development or project management, but not design work and not physical construction, no swinging hammers. And then there's the ISA, the Inbound Services Agreement, which is not a form we're involved with, but it's essentially the catch-all. So it's not really appropriate for design work, any physical work. This is a different sort of standard Google form. And then there's the family of construction agreements. So you have your traditional construction agreement. It has a pre-construction component. It's usually guaranteed a maximum price. So you execute with pre-construction. Time goes on, then you figure out what your GMP is going to be. You amend the contract, you add in the scope. It can include any MEPF design services, but not architectural. If it's going to be architectural, we have the design build agreement, which similar concept. It just allows, has better language for architectural services. And then there's the direct trade agreement. We don't use it very often, but the idea here is if you have a very small trade contractor, specialty kitchen HVAC, something like that, where they're just doing a little bit of construction or very minor design. That's a specialty agreement that we have available as well. And sorry, the first three agreements, the services agreements, are all master agreements, meaning that when you sign and you execute the first agreement, nothing really happens from there. In order to set somebody off in designing or doing any work, you have to issue a task order or a statement of work with respect to the ISA. And that's actually the document that starts them going on your project. As compared with the construction agreements, those all are project specific. So when you sign that, it sets them off on pre-con or construction with respect to your special project. Yes. So it's a, oh, I'm sorry. So the question is essentially, when do you use a master consultant agreement versus an ISA if there are technical sort of services that are not necessarily architecture or engineering? And the answer is it's clear as mud. No, there's a big gray area, right? And so we know at one end of the spectrum, design for sure goes on this form. And we know that at the other end, it's where there's absolutely no design goes on the ISA, and then somewhere in between. And it's really a judgment call each time. Basically, it comes down to is the person providing or company providing a professional service that you could measure against other professionals, or where there's a deliverable like a design document of some kind. So we had one come in recently for corrosion analysis. So not licensed engineering work, but that person is going to be measured against other professionals. We'd probably go with an MSA. We had a consultant that's sort of giving big programmatic input and just like a very simple memo about what should you build here, what should you build there. That might be on an ISA instead. So I think legal is always available to help you with those sorts of questions, but it sort of comes down to what are the details here.
Is that working? I might add one other thing. Some of our partners in the other worlds, much like NetOps, they have certain. I don't know if that's still the same. Maybe you can take that one. You almost got me on.
Okay, so. Okay,
Yeah.
can you guys hear me? So with respect to NetOps, so what we are doing now with NetOps, because they are a little bit of a different animal, and because some of the things that they need, which is truly technical in nature on the construction design side, we can't have them using ISAs. And so I've already started that conversation with their executive management side. And so they also agree that given the nature of the work that they're doing, they've taken a look at our master design construction agreement. And in some instances, it may be a little bit too robust. So we're working with them to create these form agreements so that when you guys need to have the team involved, you won't get involved in the contracting piece of it. They will, they'll own it, but we will have similar forms so that there are not dissimilarities in things that we're requiring the RUSE DevCo team to do and what they will be engaging vendors to do as well. With the question on the ISA, one thing to know too, which is why we're changing it and we've learned from the TI side is, it is not an efficient use of anyone's time here in this room. You guys are subject matter experts in what you do, design, construction, MEP. It should not be incumbent upon you to decide what's the correct contracting form. So we now want to take that off your plate. And that's why we've got the design intake form. So there is a series of questions which Chi will get to. And we will then tell you guys, you know, based on this, we may come back and have more iterative questions on, help me understand the deliverable more, help me understand exactly what you need them to do. And then we will let you know, yes, you know what, use this 4-page ISA, here's the scope of work, or no, we really do need to put them under a master services agreement. But we don't want you guys in the field, I'm going to say in the field, boots on the ground, you guys determining what the best contractual vehicle is. That's not the highest and best use for you guys. That's what we do. So don't worry that you need to pick which agreement is the appropriate agreement. We're moving away from that.
Question as part of the. Now is it on? There it is. As part of the portal you're doing,
Yes.
are we also going to have the ability to see who's already signed up to an MSA and when that MSA or ISA or DSA expires?
Yes.
Okay.
So to answer that, we actually, our PA team recently developed a master service agreement database. So we basically will see who's already contract with us and what the expiration date for those. So that will help you. Like, I think before that we even try to start with anybody new, we're going to check with the database first to make sure that one is it's active, and two is what the expiration date, whether there's need to be a new revised agreement in place. Yeah. Right. So legal intake is where to go first. um, and just continue on what Derek mentioned, right? So basically, the master agreement provide you a blanket agreement that can work across multiple projects, but the statement of work and the task order is where you specify what scope of work is needed, what the duration, and who is obligated to do what. So this is detailed out to for very project specific and scope specific. There you can raise an unlimited number of SOW or TL under one master agreement with the same Google entity. If you do business with a different Google entity, like say in Europe or some other part of the world, with that same vendor, then you might need to check whether to see if that contract with that vendor, a master agreement with that vendor exists or not. If not, then we need to raise a different one for that different Google entity. And we also have the limited notice to proceed. So this is basically applied to only for the general contractor. This is when we actually want to have a physical work of construction start before the GMP is set. So if you want to, like you said, I think, do some demo work while you're still negotiating the GMP contract, that's when we want to cut the specific LNTP for that specific scope of work with certain set timeline and pricing. um, then we do a multiple, if there's project require multiple LNTP before your GMP can agree, we can proceed with that as well. And we also have this low risk contract type, which is very limited, and we listed some of the service here that can be categorized as low risk. For example, restaurant, caterer, hotel, speaker equipment. These don't require you have to have master agreement, and you can go straight to a PO service type. So we can cut a PO without any master agreement for this specific scope. And just want to go through very quickly. I'm going to pull up the legal intake template here. So this is a template that was given to us by legal team, and we consolidate all of the questionnaire into one template. So every time you want to initiate a new contract, blanket agreement with a new vendor, you can go and take this template and just copy for yourself and fill out the relevant question. What I mean by relevant, because we don't want other question the answer for the wrong service. If you do have professional type of service, or in Derek mentioned is a service type of agreement, you can answer all the general background questions. So this is mostly about what the name of the project, who's the executive in our team, the sponsor, and then the legal business information from the vendor team. It's also including information like their licensing informations or where do they register to work. Then as we start coming down to like professional service, this is where the A&E service question type. So that you just, if you want to, you engage them with like architecture engineering service, then you answer the general and then a professional question. If you want to contract a development manager, then you answer the question for the general and the development service, which in this case under there's additional question for them that ask specific about rate and hourly rate and things like that. And then if you prepare a construction agreement, we have a full set of separate question for those as well, along with the exhibit that we listed here that can potentially provide. The form, once you fill this out, you submit the form, and the form will ask you to attach this questionnaire and any relevant exhibit that need to be coming to attach to the agreement. I'll go back in here. And for the construction services, the reason it's separate because it does have construction specific question regarding insurance, OSIP, and liquidated damage. That's why we want to emphasize more on. There's a lot more detail on the construction questionnaire. And then once you submit the form, it will prompt you to this automatic email. It will send to your inbox that it said you submitted this date and when you need it by, and legal team will take the attachment and work on it, and then they will respond to this thread and with your draft agreement, and then that's when you can, when your contract is ready to share with the vendor. So this is the sort of internal thread with us and the legal team. Some of the key takeaway when you fill out the intake and part of the master agreement process, it's the business legal name. That has to match with what they are doing business at the state level. An easy way to check is there's always public entity search on the state website. I use it very, very often whenever I just clarify, and I know Derek, you probably do the same.
Mhm.
There you can just type in the search word, make sure it's the same, is a LLC or corporation. You can search easily online. The second one is the estimate contract value. Um, Oftentimes I see requests coming in for like $10,000, $15,000. That is just an initial scope of work. If I understand most of the case, we want to know actually the full estimate for the engagement of duration throughout the project, because that number one will help us determine how rigorous the contract need to be prepared, and like if there's any change in the term and condition that needs to prepare in the back end, and also help our team route to the right authorities for the signature authority within Google. If it's a contract over like $3 million, it needs to go to the VP or senior director level and above. So that just really help us to identify appropriate level review as well. And reimbursable expense, there's a category say how much it should be for reimbursable, but we always referring back to the DevCo travel guideline policy that we issued recently with you guys. That has now been incorporated into all master agreement as an exhibit, and we will revise that document on an annual basis to update rate and like any clarification that we need to modify. So I believe on an annual basis we also revise that on master agreement too.
I think so. I think we sort of stock up changes over the course of the year. In dealing with these contracts, we get to deal with lots and lots of folks who see it with a critical eye on the other side, from all of you, from attorneys on the other side. And so, we always like to make a better mousetrap if we can. But I think that we sort of hold the form for a period of time. We sort of update them.
Yeah.
But one note about the contract amount. The idea here is, when you're asking for a contract, you may only know how much you are going to do. But if your first task order is $10,000, but there's $500,000 coming next week, it's helpful for us to know, because it gives us an idea of how critical do we need to be with changes. If it's, we can guess, but if it's a $50,000 contract versus a $3 million one, we might treat certain things differently, and certain, requests from the other side to make changes differently. And if you don't include that with your intake, we'll ask you about it as time goes on. But from the get-go, it helps us figure out how critical and how careful do we need to be in terms of resisting changes or not giving things, or, hey, let's just get this thing done. You need this next week. It's a couple $1,000s. It's okay to give them that thing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you. And for professional service, we want to also clarify that when you obtain, we want to obtain the professional license if they require like stamping or like signing in the documentation. So sometime in some cases, we've been seeing like a lot of people like providing professional license, but it's actually business license, for example, or just a state registered license. So we want to clarify that and make sure that people give us the right information for the licensing. And I think also, if for the work doing in California, they need to be registered, licensed in California. I know Sally can talk about it as well. So I just want to make sure that's in place. So for purchase order, so after you have master agreement and task order as SOW signed, we will work with Pivot to issue a purchase order for you. So all the purchase order will per project and per the scope that will be written in the TO or SOW. And then we also have the material purchase order type, which have more detail that breaking down to material line item. You can find out more information about the purchase order on the Google purchasing policy and guideline here. So key takeaway for this section is plan ahead. We want to give the legal team a lot more time to prepare, not just workload wise, but also allow us time for negotiating the term and condition. I've been distributing this look ahead trick sheet where on a monthly basis, please, if you know anybody new that coming on our team that don't have an existing contract, come to us and put it on the sheet, and we can help us getting the process start. It's much easier to do that than than you start working and engage with the vendor and then like retroactively trying to get all the agreement in place. Be sure that all the vendor must sign NDA with Google before discussing any scope of work or initiative. There's a go/NDA central that is very easy for you. You can send an invite to the vendor directly and they can sign off, and it will have a record on Simba. So we can search on NDA, search on when we prepare the master agreement. Oftentimes we get a lot of question around the insurance coverage, and if I'm like there's individual professionals, individual contributor that coming to us and they don't have the appropriate insurance coverage. Can it be reassessed, or if there's any lighter coverage that we require? All of those questions can go straight to insurance@google.com and they can help you provide the clarification. And then next one is when you negotiate in TNC, make sure the vendor provide you with a complete red line document, not a first pass, not an initial just review. I just look it over this weekend and here's my initial comment. We want a full red line document so that the legal team, when they look at the document, it's easy for them to review, so we don't have a lot of back and forth. The final agreement for execution has to come from legal team. This is what we've been experiencing since we started this legal intake process. Is sometimes that the thread it's started, but then the team agree on this is the okay to go without noticing legal that this is our final agreement. So we want to make sure that we avoid the situation where we don't know what the master agreement has been finally agreed, because there's some term and condition might be tweaked in between and we're not aware of and might have a risk for Google. So we want to make sure that the final agreement coming from our legal team. Lastly, I want to emphasize, this was not mentioned before, but just want to reiterate in here. If your vendor is a small and minority business, please encourage them to enroll into the Google Small Business Supplier Diversity Program. This will help expedite them through a faster payment cycle. So Google has a net 30, which is net 30 business day or 45 calendar day. They can shrunk it down to net 15 or even immediate payment, depending on the type of business. So this really helped them to get the invoice paid quickly, and I think they will really appreciate it. We're going through the process of review all of our vendor to see who potentially qualify, and maybe send them a reminder, say, hey, you can actually enroll into this program. So we'll keep you guys update on that progress in the next coming weeks. So with that, any question for this section? Yes.
On the insurance piece, so I'm kind of like trying to think through all the pieces of if I'm trying to get a project or a contract up and going, what I'm doing versus what TNT is doing versus legal versus insurance. So it sounds like step one is the intake form. I'm used to coordinating with TNT, but on the insurance piece, who else needs to be like kind of copied on that so that if insurance says, yeah, it's okay to waive this kind of insurance in this condition, that it gets back to, is it legal or is it TNT or both?
So when you initiate the questionnaire, so legal will say, okay, we need to consult with the insurance, and then we will create a ticket with insurance. So when you email the insurance at google.com, it will generate a ticket with them.
Okay.
So we will facilitate a conversation, and then once they agree, say either insurance can be waived or the new term can be applied, then we can attach the new language in the contract.
Great. So it's
We're going to go in
yeah.
more detail on this
Okay.
later too, but no. But just to give you the very short lifespan of the negotiation and contract
Mhm.
formation, the idea is we get the intake, we usually do a draft, the project team will send it out. There's changes that come back, and then legal looks at it. I'm giving you the really short version, but we sort of figure out, all right, this question needs to go to legal, this has to go to the business folks, this has to go to EHS, and this has to go to insurance. And then we'll inform the project team, hey, can you guys please send this to insurance@google.com?
okay.
And then that creates a ticket, and we defer to risk with some input. We help them, understand the ramifications, because sometimes the insurance change
Yeah.
might impact the body of the agreement or the
Sure.
regular terms and conditions or limits of liability, things like that. So we help categorize the changes and then help sort of spread them out. But we need the project team help to open that ticket and get it reviewed.
Sure, that makes a lot of sense. But like the most important part of our job in initiating it is describing the issues in the intake form so that you can help us navigate that process.
At the time of intake, you probably won't know of any problems with insurance just
A
because
lot of times it's like, I know this might be an independent contractor, whole nother thing, but that, or a small business that we're not asking for design services. So I want to like make a flag that we shouldn't be holding them to a certain type of liability insurance or something. And so we can get them going quickly. And so stuff like that, kind of like highlighting, I see an opportunity here for it to be waived because of the nature of the work or.
Sure, I think that if
Something
you
like
know
that.
about that in the intake, you can make that affirmative
Mhm.
request, and legal will sort of look at it and say, hey,
That sounds
let's
right
go
to-
here,
yeah.
or let's not do that for some reason.
Sure.
It's our experience that usually you don't know that until they've looked at it and they come back and say, hey, I don't have that insurance.
Sure,
But
yeah.
if you know about it ahead of time, let us know, and we can get on it earlier.
Like
Gotcha.
if you know your vendor has enrolled in our small business diversity, small business women-owned diverse, we have different insurance contracting requirements for those teams. But at this stage, you
Uh-huh.
won't have the actual legal requirements for the insurance requirements. But in the intake form, if you let us know, one of the things I want to make sure people understand is we're a multi-billion-dollar publicly traded company, and we should be dealing with vendors other than small business, women-owned minority entities, right? We do have, I think, an obligation to support these smaller women minority-owned businesses, which we absolutely need to embrace. But I want to make sure people understand when people are just coming in, a company, an Inc., an LLC, they can or they should be getting $5 million commercial general liability. That is so standard. And when someone says, I only have two, that is because they don't want to pay for the initial cost for it.
Mhm.
And because I don't want to use the word crying about it, it doesn't mean that suddenly now I'm negotiating with my own business team about what is appropriate coverage for Google. So we're a united
Mhm.
front together, although you are really the front facing entity to the vendor. What I don't want people doing is just say, well, I don't know, reach Sally, contact Sally at Sally at Google. I'm out of it. And now suddenly I've got 50,000 people saying, hey, I want to talk to you about this. Hey, I want to talk to you about that. I just need you guys to continue to be the front line of defense, and we're on the back end. And to the extent there are specific legal and technical discussions, we will absolutely then be side by side with you so that you're not fending these very nuanced questions that you're like, I have no idea.
Mhm.
This is being sort of dictated down from a business unit cross-functional stakeholder. So we'll be there to help you. But I want to make sure people understand that because a vendor that is very important to you get onboarded, that doesn't mean Google then steps back and we quasi underwrite everything for them because they don't want to step up to liability. They just want the money and the work. But then when it comes down to it, they don't want any of the risk. That's a great gig if you can get it when you're a smaller company dealing with a smaller company, but not with Google and not at the level of deals that DevCo is dealing with. You guys aren't doing these smaller one-off TI projects. You're doing the multi hundred of million to billion-dollar projects. So we need to make sure that our risks are covered off and we're working accordingly.
That's super helpful context because I don't know that 5 versus 2 million is the standard. So that's helpful to know in terms of having context for what the ask might be. Also, it totally makes sense to me on the construction capital project side that it needs to be really rigorous. I think on the OpEx side, sometimes we end up with really it's the small diversity piece, but also sometimes it's a really niche expertise.
Even, I know you guys are going to start working on, Drew's been getting a lot for landings, hiring the one-off sculptural artist, where we know in our public plaza areas, those are huge. But there's also a very different legal indemnity requirement that goes back to those artists because of the nature of what they do. And then what becomes codified an obligation to the owner as to what we have to do. And so that's why in those smaller where, let's say it's going to cost $5 million, not to sound pejorative, to you and I, $5 million is a lot of money, but to Google, drop in the bucket. So if we're going to hire a vendor, an artist, to do a sculptural piece that's $5 million, Granted, they are a one, it could be just a one person artist where they work out of a studio in their backyard. I understand that, but we still need to be very cognizant of, is it something that's getting suspended in the entranceway versus it is a piece that's just going to sit and is bolted down into a middle of a fountain, right? So there's just certain things that we have to ask you, and it is very specific to the project. So we'll always come back and ask you guys very specific questions to ensure that we're not forcing these very large onerous requirements on a small, I don't want to use an SBA, but on a smaller, let's say, incorporated company where they could, they just choose not to.
Two more questions. On Go/NDA, when I started, there were two links. It was very easy. Are we still using commercial NDA? Because now there's 30 links, and I just want to make sure that we're still.
It's still the commercial NDA for North America. I mean, at least for DevCo right now. Yes.
I want to check because
Yeah.
obviously there's a lot of new people.
Yeah.
We're giving them tools.
Unless you guys are going to engage a vendor, or we're going to develop. So if we're going to collaboratively develop IP together, then I want to use, instead of when you go to NDA Central, we'll have a link to a development NDA.
So
So to answer Josh's question, if you guys are engaging a vendor who's going to work collaboratively to create IP, intellectual property, that then Google wants to own, because then what we want to do is we want to then reuse that IP in other projects without having to go back, seek consent, pay royalties, or pay any sort of fee to the other developer. Then we want you, instead of doing a general NDA, to come in and click on the development NDA. And if you guys ever have any questions when you're trying to figure out which NDA needs to get put in place, feel free to you can ping Molly or I over chat. You can send us an email. That's a really quick answer. It's just we may ask you a couple questions about what is it that they're doing and what is the deliverable that we're going to be utilizing and how will we utilize it.
And last question, I promise. On the POs you mentioned,
Yeah.
Is there a dollar threshold too?
For the low risk contract, there's no dollar threshold for low risk contract, but there's only selected type of low risk that it qualifies. So you might want to just double check on what qualify underneath there. So yeah. Okay. So there's a question on the door here from Alsam. He asked for if some of the small business we bring on our project have experienced issue getting paid through the architect or GC. If they contract directly to Google, can they get paid within 10 days? Can this mechanism also work through GC and architect? I think this is if they are contracted through GC and architect, this largely depend on their relationship and how the contract was written with the GC and architect. There's no guarantee that they will get paid. I think that's based on their negotiation. But if they do directly contract with us, their possibility, if they are small business again and diversity business, we don't guarantee everybody getting paid within the 10 days, and there's no 10 days at Google. Yeah.
And I'm not familiar with the alternate sort of payment time, but just generally speaking, if somebody is a sub to a GC or an architect, and that person in turn has an agreement with Google, all the checks that go to that sub consultant need to go through the GC or the architect, just as a legal matter, a contractual matter. That being said, I'm not as familiar with the alternate payment thing, so I don't want to speak, and Sally might yell at me, but generally speaking, that's the idea. No? Yes?
Yeah.
Okay.
Chris, yeah.
Oh, yeah. What contracts are we using for artists?
For
Artists?
artists.
Oh, there's a separate artist agreement. Heather Riley is an attorney in our office, and I'm not familiar with those. Sally,
Sure.
Molly,
Molly,
you deal with those.
And yet again, we have an intake form for this agreement. So I'm sorry, you guys, but we can make sure that the art and artist agreement intake form, because sometimes we've learned that sometimes for the artwork that's going in the buildings, you may not want to contract directly with the artist. You may actually work with an art gallery
You may actually want to have a rotational art program with someone. So we've got different types of agreements in place for that. And there is an intake form. So I'll work with Chi to make sure that we are supplanting this. So there's only one stop shop. You guys aren't looking at all these different sort of go/links, so that everything is in there. But we'll put the art and artist agreements in there too for the form intake.
Thank you. I think that wrap up our section, this section, and would like introduce Katie. We'll talk about the contract life cycle.
Okay, so in this section, we're going to look at the overall contract life cycle, the approvals process, and the systems and tools that we use in Google DevCo to get contracts in place. So in terms of the life cycle, your first phase is obviously initiation. So your vendor submits your proposal through the project approval portal. Then we go to review and negotiate. So we review the proposal and negotiate the contract terms and conditions with the vendor. Then we go on to approvals. So the contract is drafted and it's submitted for internal business approvals. You then go into execution in terms of the contract is signed by all relevant parties and a purchase order is issued to the vendor. We then go into contract administration, which includes the review and approval of invoices on a monthly basis. And then in the closeout phase, it would be approval of retention, if that's applicable to the contract, and closing out the PO in Pivot. If any change orders need to be implemented during that life cycle, then we go back to the start and we go through that phase again. So in terms of systems and tools that are used within Google DevCo, first step is in terms of the approval submission portal. So that's used using the Google Forms tool. It's project specific. It's used to record and track vendor proposal submissions and preliminary approvals. So a form is filled out, which then automatically generates a spreadsheet. So that saves a lot of the manual input in terms of tracking and recording approvals. We then use PIMS, which is a Google internal tool. So PIMS is the acronym for Project Information Management and Metrics System. It's used to communicate, review, and approve project-related changes through a structured workflow. And we'll look at each workflow a little bit later. And that's used for business, cost, and legal approvals. So it's very important that each of those three things are signed off in the PIMS system. DocuSign does what it says, obviously, and is used for signature of contract documentation, which is the same tool that is used for signing of master agreements. And then Pivot, again, we love an acronym in Google. It's a purchase order and an invoice visibility tool. So that's used to get your PO funding released from with finance. So in terms of approvals, from a project point of view, there's a set of prerequisites. So your project must have spend approval and funding in place via go to build, which is obviously what Matt covered earlier. You must have a project F code. So that's specific to each project. Before an execution workflow can be created, you must have a project dashboard within PIMS, and your funding must be allocated appropriately. All four approval tools must be utilized. So as we just said, you spend approval portal, PIMS, DocuSign, and Pivot. And your vendor must be set up in PIMS. So vendor prerequisites, they must be a registered entity within Oracle and Pivot. They must have completed an NDA as per Chi's comment. And they must have an approved master agreement where applicable. So that's obviously in terms of your SOW and your TO. So in terms of the approval process and workflows, you've obviously got various stakeholders involved in that process. So sort of running from top to bottom, we've got the T&T PA team. As we said, you've got a project-specific PA assigned. Then you've got your T&T PCM and your development manager. You've then obviously got the vendor themselves, your Google manager, the legal team, and Google Finance. So, and we've got a timeline across the top here. So this is in terms of your baseline, which we would like to work with, is 15 days. Obviously, there may be instances where it takes longer than that. There may be instances where you can expedite, but we use sort of 15 days as a baseline timeline. So in terms of step one, your vendor submits your proposal via the approval portal. We then go into in terms of review and negotiation. So that's T&T, your DM, obviously the vendor themselves, and your Google manager. Your T&T PCM or your DM initiate the contract request. The PA team then draft that contract. It's then QA'd again by the PCM and the DM. And then we start the workflow in PIMS. So everything prior to that stage is done outside of PIMS. So the contract's initiated for approval. It's then signed for cost and scope approval by your PCM and your DM. You then get business approvals from your Google Manager. Legal team obviously sign it from a legal aspect. Then we come out of PIMS and we go through DocuSign to get your signatures from all parties. So that's obviously your vendor, your Google Manager. Then we go through Pivot in terms of submitting a requisition. The PO is then approved in Pivot by your Google Manager. It's then released by Google Finance, and then it can be sent to the vendor and uploaded on the drive. So in terms of PIMS, just a quick overview on the workflow. Your initiator, like we said, is your T&T PA. Your on-site PM is your development manager. Your cost manager is your PCM. And then obviously legal, your DE, and your district lead. You then go through a separate workflow for DocuSign. So just the item there in terms of your director and your VP, SVP, it's dependent on the spend limit. So if it's over a certain threshold, it would need to be signed off by your VP or your SVP. It then gets logged back in PIMS in terms of it's been routed for signature, then goes through your Pivot workflow, and then it's logged back again in PIMS to say that the PO funding's been released. So you can see sort of PIMS across the top is your full end-to-end life cycle in terms of your approval. So in terms of a change order, it's a very similar process in terms of a change order request is submitted through the portal. It then goes to the PCM and DCM to review and approve the cost and schedule impact, and the same then it goes on to your Google Manager. Then we initiate a change order in PIMS, and then the workflow is as previous for your contract. So contract administration and invoicing, these are just some prerequisites in terms of a fully executed contract and a purchase order must be in place before any vendor can commence work. Any invoices that are raised dated prior to PO issuance will be rejected. And that's sort of a common error that we've seen recently, which we're aiming to improve on that in 2019. Vendors working on multiple projects must submit a separate invoice for each purchase order, which is quite important because often vendors think they can just submit one and they can segregate the work within that, but you must submit a separate invoice for each purchase order. Invoice or payment application for a GC needs to represent the cost of work in the specified period. And all invoices must be reviewed by your DM, your PCM, and your project accountant prior to uploading to GIST. So GIST is Google's internal release tool in terms of invoicing. Approved invoices will only be stamped by the project accountant and returned to the vendor by email. We've got a sample shot of the new approval stamp. So invoices missing the approval stamp will be rejected, and then that causes the payment terms to restart at resubmission. So your payment term, which is typically net 30 business days, begins when the invoice is submitted to GIST, not when it's submitted for initial review via the invoice submission form. So as we said in the sort of the starter section, that all invoices are required to follow the travel policy unless there's any exceptions in the contract. And expenses exceeding the 180-day validity window will be rejected. So in terms of what we're looking for in terms of invoicing against the contract, it's validation of the following. So in terms of what, when, and who, so the scope of work that's being delivered, is it actually a true reflection of the scope that you can see in the field? Obviously in terms of design of what's been complete. Date, so when was the work completed, and resources, obviously who completed the work. How much? So looking at your contract type, is it a lump sum? Is it T&M? Is it GMP? We have had some instances where somebody's on a lump sum contract and then they start invoicing on a T&M basis, and we have to kick that back. Rates, so obviously are resources being charged at the rates as per the contract, and reimbursables, like we say, are they in line with the DevCo policy and within the 180-day window? And then in terms of additional checks, we're looking at, is it the correct PO for that project? Is it the correct project that they build against? Do we have sufficient funding in the purchase order? Have they completed the submission requirements? So in terms of the summary and the checklist and the appropriate waivers, looking for any math errors, and then looking for duplication. So we have had a number of vendors who have submitted an invoice more than once, trying to get paid more than once. So obviously that's been kicked back. So in terms of key takeaways, your project must have spend approval and funding in place via Go to Build. Employees cannot give business approval for their own spend. So business approval from the requester's manager is mandatory even when the spend amount is within the requester's signature authority. So obviously that's specific to Google. A fully executed contract and purchase order must be in place before they can commence work. Any invoices raised that are dated prior to the PO will be rejected. And this is an important one in terms of if you are an approver in PIMS or in Pivot, please set a delegation rule when you're out of office. And then that means that your approvals are automatically directed within the system. So expense claims exceeding 180 days will be rejected. So something that was implemented last week, so Chi sent a note on this in terms of DEs have got a discretionary 3 exceptions limit per vendor if they choose to accept those expenses. That's up to the DE. And we have a dedicated PA resource for each project. So please reach out to them specifically if you require any assistance in any of those processes. Anybody have any questions?
There was in one of the slides before when you talked about the process to approve invoices. Yeah, that fourth bullet. If we're trying to pay a small business vendor within 10 days, how does that work?
I could let Chi speak to that. I'm not too sure on the response.
So it just they get paid and then that happens?
So it should be set against the vendor within GIST. So as soon as you submit to GIST, the clock starts ticking dependent on your terms and conditions.
Yeah, so the prior process doesn't, I mean, we do trying to, there's a 3 business day for our PA team to turn around for like if there's any common. So basically the moment they submit it on the portal, the PA team has 3 days to turn around their approved invoice if there's no issue. If there's an issue, there's certainly back and forth and there's going to be expended on time. But we do trying to, whatever the GIST plus the 3-day standard for our team for review. Yeah.
So Kathy, and then to put a finer pin on that payment term, that's after the DevCo team has authorized and approved, right? So then they'll get paid quicker. But something for everyone to understand here is everyone is busy. If you guys are sitting on these invoices for 20 days, the vendor then thinks, well, what's going on? My clock has been ticking for 20 days. I should be paid in 10. So it's really something that's important that everybody is very keyed into. When they're submitting invoices, you need to timely review them because if you have issues, then they need to know sooner rather than later because they need to resubmit supporting documentation. This team has never done it, but what we have experienced before is people are so buried, they're automatically approving. When we go to close the project out through internal audit, it then becomes noticed, hey, you guys approved invoices where they were not following our travel and expense policy, and now they have an expenses to reimburse of 50 grand. They also were using owner's contingency and you approved it. So now you guys are short on your funding. And then they come to legal going, what can I do? I'm not, right? So then there was a comment here where it said, you guys have to fund in accordance with the agreement. We spend months negotiating these agreements. That doesn't mean that once we've stamped it and signed it, it goes in a drawer and nobody looks at it again. That's how you guys are doing your job, by looking at the actual agreement, what the deliverables are, what the payment terms are, how they're going to be seeking their invoice approvals. You guys have to follow that. And so that's why I want to make sure the contract then the contract becomes your Bible of how you're supposed to do your job, including all the exhibits. So I really want to make sure there's a fine point on that. You have to read the contract. I know that they're long, but in order for you to do your job and do it successfully and continue, if you're a vendor or a Googler, to do well, you've got to understand the confines of what we're supposed to be working with the vendor under, and that's the contract.
Yeah, and that's just to sort of reiterate on that in terms of the clock starts ticking once it enters into GIST. It actually starts ticking obviously once the approvals are ticked, so it's valid. So if someone, and that comes back to your out of office delegation. If you go out of office for 2 weeks, it's not delegated to somebody else, then that vendor's waiting to get paid for obviously a more extended period of time.
Is there still let's see, paying for permit fees? Is there a mechanism now to do that where, like, I know the city of Mountain View is set up to receive wire transfers from
So
us?
GUIs, yep. So there's GUIs and manual payments, which the project accounting team can support in processing that as well.
Is it only with certain,
All
jurisdictions are-
municipalities. Yep,
okay, but only municipalities at this point?
that's correct.
And is that going to be, could we extend that to other agencies like the EPA or the Water Board, like where we have to pay ongoing fees for their review time and whatnot?
We'll have to review
Yeah.
it.
Or from the dory?
Yeah.
Okay. So question that come through on the dory from Kristen. We have a ton of hard copy lease contracts brought to Dave for wet signature. Can any of these be processed via DocuSign going forward so he can sign while mobile? Which ones are going for wet
Sally,
signature?
can you help with this one?
Hi, Kristen, this is Sally. So for anything that the DevCo team is doing on the transactional construction and design, those are all going through DocuSign and PIMS. For leasing matters, there's a separate email chain that I've been on with Emily. There's going to be a separate work stream, Kristen, on what the transaction management team handles, and those are the leases. And so I think Emily, myself, working with Jay and others, we'll figure something out with Dave where hopefully Dave won't have as many wet signature originals needed and we can process electronically. But for DevCo, you guys should be doing everything under DocuSign and PIMS. One off accepted.
Yeah. We got the next question is from Michelle. She's asked, some smaller project don't have a TNT handling contract and invoice. What's the standard contract and invoice process? So I think ideally we want to, they still basically follow the same process. If there's, requirement that we need an internal team, then just escalate to myself and Ro. We can help sort out the resource, but mostly project will be handling on themselves, right? If the CBRE related.
Thanks, Michelle. So as I mentioned in the introductions, Parham's infrastructure team and transportation team aren't leveraging TNT to manage the process. That said, they should still be, your CBRE team should be still going through the legal intake form. And I believe transportation is now set up in PIMS, so they'll look at the contract workflow there as well. So I guess that's the response for CBRE work hasn't rolled over yet.
Yeah, so I know transportation we haven't set up on PIMS yet, so it might be still just follow the CBRE process, and they will handle all the transactional process for now. Yeah.
I think in the spirit of being transparent, I'm going to go back to, so there are some items for the DEs that we will have to still do wet signed on. For instance, I have a license agreement in my hand that may be one off. So just in the spirit of, there's some people that intake, I think Sally, just like she did here, she can direct us whether it can go, if it needs to take the form of a wet sign versus stand up.
Thank you, Josh. We passed to the contract section. Now we got to the legal teams, and I would like to invite Derek and Gary on for this legal recommendation, and along with Novi. Are you, Molly? Are you coming on this one as well?
Do you guys want to just power through or take a 5-10 minute break? Break?
All right.
Okay.
Let's do a quick break.
Let's come back at 2:25. Okay.
Get more energy. We'll be back in,
Josh has got like 22 questions.
we'll be back in
Subtext.
2:25.
There was a
Thank
mistake
you.
when they set up the room with Josh next to the microphone.
I like, oh, that's not gonna play out well.
I'm trying to make quota.
Just when we're getting to the fun stuff.
So I have some slides.
Oh, yeah. No, but they're just some outlines.
Yeah. I'll run through this one.
So I'm taking.
Perfect.
You won't allow it.
Perfect.
Yeah.
I know. I'm sorry.
Hello, I'm Michael. Nice to meet you.
Nice to see you. I've never met Derek in person.
Oh, sure.
Nice to meet you.
Just reading a draft TIA.
Oh, that's job here. That's already, that's already like here.
Yeah. Yeah.
Oh.
Yeah, it's good.
You were kidding me.
Hasn't been great.
Their rule of because it's not trigger in effect. The fact that 10 years ago, with this old plan, they never assumed anyone would actually build to the max.
I don't know what.
They have, but what it doesn't
All
assume,
of that, those developments would have been done.
but it never assumed other developments elsewhere.
Well, it had to assume some, but probably not all. So right now you're dealing with the traffic effects of all the developments. And. Yeah.
Government already.
Unavoidable.
Yeah,
Significantly unavoidable.
No, I'm really good.
Yeah.
So you already need a standard board writing considerations. But you can't get that without actually doing PR. Here.
So we'll see.
But what you're gonna get into is they're gonna say, well, this old other EIR was 10 years old.
But they're saying that you might be able to use the lead scale.
Hi, good, how are you?
Oh, did you? I've only had, each one, because I was like,
A little bit, yeah.
All of it at once.
Updated project schedule yesterday. Here, do this, do that.
It's gonna be nice.
Yeah, a little bit.
It will be.
Yeah, I don't want to believe that it's putting it in, throw the precedent, you know, so they're just pushing it out.
Oh, yeah,
And, you know, it's like, don't be optimistic that, you know, we're not doing it any longer.
Oh, that's what John said to you.
Oh, you got, that's right, because we've been optimistic, we've been.
You always have to start on the opposite, optimistic.
Of course you do,
If you
because if
go
you don't,
where
you're not gonna be
are,
pushing for it,
you
right?
never get-
You're not gonna be pushing for it, so you have. But it's just. So we'll see.
Yes.
Question. Oh, Sally,
How are you?
Nice to see you.
I know, it's so good to see you.
Oh, yeah. That's the way they are. Yeah. I don't even have to do a calculation and he knows I'm not. There used to be traffic.
But he did close. Yeah, exactly. Hello, Kathy. Josh and I are going to be
Fireside
presenting.
chat. I just, these chairs look so comfortable.
I always wanted to know the world before you touch on.
It's a very interesting world.
I'm sure.
I see the world in a whole, as Mary Davidge tells me almost every day she sees me. I see the world in a wholly different way than she does. Wholly different. It is wholly different.
Totally different.
But I tell her, coming back to everyone sees the world.
Well, they need you on my project.
Thank you. Yeah, you had to do an MMR for each message.
So yeah, they made us do that.
Well, no, these chairs are so comfortable. I wanted to see what they were like. They are so comfortable.
Okay.
You're gonna have a panel?
Oh, a panel.
Nice.
Half the room's up here. So Derek, why don't you go, I'll stand next to you. You Yeah, so.
Yeah.
Oh, man, it was nasty.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I think it's like 30 million.
Yeah, so. That's what we can. They say yes.
Yeah, yes, immediately.
He's been in the meeting, so I know you don't want to share that. So. Because they're going to carry through. Everybody else is going to see. Well, that's a GCC. You have 5 or 3 terms, which are you can't hold. Shit. That's crazy. Ready to go.
Okay, everyone, we're going to get started. Derek and Gary are going to go through legal recommendations that they have based on their experience working on our program.
All right.
So I'm new to the front. So if I haven't met you, I'm Gary McKitterick. May have seen my email as well, but so we'll go through these things. I work for Sally always and Molly, and it's a privilege to work with you guys. First of all, there's a lot of fun things you're doing, but we have been seeing a few things that we're going to make some observations on. Go ahead.
Yeah, so these are just sort of, we'll talk a little bit about the process with contracting. There's sort of our best tips and suggestions and how we can help you accomplish what all of you want to do, which is get your project going and get it complete. So first off, working without a contract is probably the worst case scenario for Google. The whole concept of a contract is you're laying out literally on, so that you're on the same page as the other side about what your respective responsibilities are. Without a contract, it's a free-for-all in terms of what the liability is if something goes wrong. So if there's a construction accident, somebody gets hurt on the job site, there's no agreement in place, it's really open to whatever the default law is in the particular state that you're in. If you get a proposal from an architect and you have that architect start working on something and they do a bunch of work for you and you don't ever have a signed agreement, it's possible that whatever was in that proposal might control. And I can guarantee that proposal says that they own all the work product that they produce, which is not how Google approaches those things. So in all cases, having a contract in place is really critical. And that being said, you can always get legal on board at the RFP stage. We love when someone comes to us and says, hey, I'm doing this kind of project. We're going to send it out and we want the contractors to see the agreement right now so they can't complain about it later, or so that we can evaluate their respective changes now. So more than happy to prepare a version for that. But master agreements with task orders, there cannot be a task order without a master agreement in place. And likewise, there cannot be a limited notice to proceed without a construction agreement in place. So we had one team that issued a limited notice to proceed to a contractor they expected to contract with. We didn't know about it until sometime down the line, but if you look back at that limited notice to proceed, it had no preceding contract. And if you looked at it carefully, it was actually between the project executive as an individual person and the contractor. So when we got down to the contracting part, we had to undo that a bit, but that's a little scary for you individually, not just Google. And the Google standard PO terms are not intended for design agreements. They don't have all the protections there with respect to ownership of the intellectual property, indemnity, defense that the specialized agreements do. So those aren't good options to use in place of or as a stopgap until you have an agreement in place. So with respect to communications, it's super important that emails between legal and the project team stay confidential. It's happened a few times where we might come back with some questions. Hey, what does the team think about A, B, and C? and somebody will forward that to the contractor and say, what do you think about A, B, and C? Let our legal folks know. In the worst case scenario, it's got months and months and months and months of back and forth about, hey, what might Google be willing to give? We can't do this, but maybe we'll agree to that later. And you've just given that all over to the other side. Certainly everything that's in there is no longer privilege. It's all, the privilege has been vitiated so that it is fully discoverable, and most likely. Likewise, if there's a comment from legal in an email, you don't want to copy and paste it and send it over, just so you're not sending the email. Sometimes we'll say, hey, here's these, take these bulleted items and send this over to the contractor, to the vendor, ask them these things, but we'll say that very specifically. It's the same idea with forwarding the email. You might not be forwarding the email, but you're giving up our comments. Communications with public entities, city, county, state, just keep in mind that those things are likely subject to disclosure. So, where you might be communicating with a private entity, it could be different, but emails to and from city, county, state could be disclosed later. So just something to keep in mind when you send those emails. When we prepare drafts, we'll usually say, here's a draft, take a look at it, wait till Molly or Sally approves it before you send it out. The big reason is that we don't want to have put something in there that's a suggested change or maybe just a comment to the team to look at or consider. We don't want that going out to the other side because it's really hard to backtrack on something. Once they've seen it, we can't say, we decided not to give that to you, just send it back, please. They don't take kindly of that. So likewise, if we do have comments in there, whatever those comments are, no longer privileged because they've been shared with the other side.
So one of the things I want to talk about just on as we're putting in this perspective, the contracts generally are simply an allocation of risk. So had an earlier conversation on one of the projects here this morning. The business decisions kind of around it drive the legal language that we draft. So as we allocate risk, we're going to ask questions that in these drafts or in emails. That's why it's so particularly important that you not share it with the other side, because we're getting a judgment call based upon risk allocation. And so just to put it in perspective, those are the, when Derek says the privilege, that's a communication. Things that we say with Google are protected from the outside. And that's what we're still trying to maintain. So that's what that kind of all means. But the allocation of risk, that's why we're going to ask you some risk questions. And when you feed those back to us, then we put it in the agreement, then it's okay to go out.
So just to add to what Gary said, there will be times, because we are a very TVC heavy company, but there will be times where I will ask to specifically remove TNT, CBRE, SGRNC, whomever the third party vendor is, because as we talk about this concept called privilege, what that means is anytime someone who is a non-Googler has access to a written communication, it then becomes discoverable when you're dealing with a public entity. So when the worst case scenario happens and there is litigation, and now we're in discovery, all these emails that happen between you and let's say TNT, those become discoverable and they can be released to the other side, right? So I do want to make sure that people don't take offense to when we say, you know what, I'm removing all non-Googlers to this email chain. And then going forward for a DE or a DM, for you then to take everything and then forward it back to your PM, who is a third-party vendor, that again taints the privilege. So we've got to keep it clean all the way through, that it's only Googlers. But here's another thing is, Kathy Popovic sending an email to Jeff Curry, it's not privileged. What makes it privileged is that a lawyer is involved. So you can't just, and then another thing is you can't privilege everything, right? Courts they will have an issue if everything we say is privileged. They're going to take a much more they're going to be much more circumspective over things that we're deeming to be privileged if we deem everything to be privileged, because not everything is privileged. So that's another thing to keep in mind.
So as part of the contracting process, we might send the group, hey, here's a clean version, and here's a red line, by the way, against the agreement we just did for ABC Architect. This is for XYZ, but look at this, what we gave for ABC. And usually we'll include in our instructions, hey, after there's approval, please send the Word document. Please don't send the PDF. And it's important to follow those things because just like with giving up the early draft that might show a change we don't want to give, that PDF or that, whatever that document is might show something that we don't want to communicate to the other side. So we try to be very specific in our emails. If there's ever a question, if we weren't clear in an email, if you're just not sure, please ask us. We're more than happy to email right back, a phone call, GVC, smoke signal, whatever you'd like to use to reach us. We're more than happy to answer those questions. So along the same lines, it's important that legal controls the draft from the very start to the very end. Just sort of looking at the big picture here, legal will do the first draft. It's looked at by the team, it's approved by in-house legal, it goes to the vendor, they'll look at it and make some changes, send it back. Legal takes that document and then categorizes the changes, right? Some are for insurance, some are for EHS, some are legal business, and some are just business. And we'll try and sort of allocate those questions out and walk you through who needs to approve. And you can tell us if you're okay with that extra money or not extra money. But all along the way, legal controls the drafting. Part of the reason is that we don't want any changes that are inadvertent or otherwise to end up in the final document. It's happened before where legal might draft up a document, it goes to the vendor, it comes back to the project team only. There's a few changes that are shown in those red line track changes that look okay. They accept it, they send it on through signature, and maybe by accident the team didn't realize that there were other changes that were made in that document that weren't vetted through legal. So you have two problems, that the changes that are shown weren't vetted, and there might be other changes that are not shown to you at all. And so having legal control helps as a safeguard against that from happening.
So one of the other things that's unique to Google because of your market presence, and that's precedential value of changes. So it happens in every deal. Someone will say, well, can we do this? And the answer may be, we really can't because we haven't done that as from a company-wide perspective. And so Sally and Molly and Derek and, the legal teams are really careful to try to think about precedential value, things that come in, indemnities in particular. You get a lot of them in your contracts. And they're going to want to ask for changes. So there may be some, and that's why legal needs to make sure that we're the ones altering that contract because of that precedential value. The contractors in this market talk to each other. If we give and ultimately make an allocation of risk change, that will likely come back to us. And it will then, someone will say, well, you did it for so-and-so, or they'll make the request. We need to be prepared as a company. And so we look at it at that macro level as well as just your project. And sometimes the answer is going to be no. And it may feel like, oh, gee whiz, it's just, my project's only, a certain size. Well, if that was the only project and that company only did that file, that probably would have been okay, but it's not in the context of the whole thing. So it's a little, we just want to at least understand that precedential value on how we do things. Liquidated damages, indemnities, all these things have precedential value.
So again, on the same lines of controlling the draft, it's also important that there's control over the very final draft. So, even if the last version that comes from the vendor has a few changes that are totally approved, usually the legal team will prepare the very final document. We'll convert it into a PDF and say, here is the final thing. This is what can be uploaded to DocuSign. One of the reasons for that is really mundane in that Word and Google Docs sometimes don't get along very well. On purpose, I don't know, but they don't. But in any event, so something as simple as a section number can get changed when there's a conversion to Google Docs. All of a sudden, a previous reference to section 8.2 is now actually 8.3. And depending on what it is, it might have a meaningful effect on the contract. Now, it's a mistake and it's inadvertent, but it's still in there and you have to backtrack it at some point. And providing the final PDF also makes sure that the thing that's being executed is the most up-to-date, current, correct document that there is. It's sort of the last safeguard that every single thing in there needs to be in there. For example, the date. It sounds kind of silly, but we always want to make sure that the execution date of the document is the most up-to-date date, because sometimes we start negotiating in November, we don't sign until May. Pick your time period, but it's important that the date be current for bigger reasons than just what we do. Google as a company doesn't want to be signing agreements that are old. Last item on the final draft is some teams will get the certificates of insurance from the vendor, which is awesome to do. Great to get that ahead of time. And it's wonderful to provide that when, around the time that you're sending the contract for execution. What we don't want to have, though, is that the certificate of insurance be appended to the end of that document when you send it up for a DocuSign. So if you have the PDF going up and it's the contract, Exhibit A, Exhibit B, and then there's a certificate of insurance at the back of it. That's not really part of the contract, but it's in that thing that's being executed. If there's something in that certificate of insurance that doesn't match what's required in the contract, Google's probably deemed to be aware that the insurance doesn't match up and may not be able to hold the vendor to the actual requirements of the agreement. So it seems silly, but just, keep them separate. But it is important to get, but you just want to keep them separate. So some just overall tips and best practices, things that we've seen over the years that help us help you. Completing the intake as fully as you possibly can, email addresses and states and exact names and things like that. Just because if we don't have it in there, we have to send an email to you. You have to be annoyed that we're sending you an email asking about it. You send an email back to us. You have to update. And so to the best you can to complete it, the intake as fully as you possibly can. It really helps us, and it makes us, it helps us draft it more quickly and get you your document as fast as possible. Giving us as much lead time as you can is helpful. We know that there's always a rush. There's always something urgent you need at last minute, but giving us more lead time lets us give you a better product. When changes come back from a contractor, we don't make the call on business decisions. Our goal as lawyers is to take whatever it is you want the deal to be and to put words in the contract and to make it say what you want it to say. So when there are business changes in there, it's helpful if the team reviews those and says, we agree to hire contingency, to hire a contractor's fee. We're not okay with this term or that term because we're ultimately going to ask you anyway what you want to do. So to the extent that you can look at it first and give us those details, it helps the process along. So exhibits, especially for construction agreements, sometimes contractors try to put in information, or not, I'm not trying to say it's nefarious, but they might have standard exhibits that they use where they're in the list of exclusions, it says things like not responsible for delay damages or for hazardous materials or for X, Y, and Z. And those are things that are all dealt with in the contract. So when you get exhibits, you ask for a schedule of values. It's important to take a look through it and make sure that the contingency matches up to what you're expecting. The fee matches what you're expecting. As legal, we try and give those things a review, but we're also not as well situated as the project team to actually look through and figure out, hey, they are supposed to be doing that elevator on the other side of the building, but they've excluded it. And that's not something that we can catch. And then letting us know about things that are unusual. If the work is being done on property that Google doesn't own or lease, or on public property, if there's environmental issues, if you're asking for a contract for a very small project, but in fact it's part of a 15 building project worth a couple $100 million, all that's information that helps us do a better job of giving you a document that matches your project and that it's accurate and correct.
So there's a couple things on overall, aren't on this slide, but questions that come up. We have updated the MSA currently. We have a current version of the MSA. We will annually, essentially, round numbers, annually look at it. The question comes up all the time. We just had an MSA expire with whoever. We'd like to, can we just amend it? Our first question is ask Sally in case there's a unique circumstance. Absent a unique circumstance, I believe the standing requirement you should assume is that the new forms, because there's corporate compliance items that come through that are we've updated these forms for, and so the vendors need to sign the new MSAs. They certainly will say, well, wait a minute, I just did this 3 years ago or 4 years ago. Well, yes, and you've got the privilege of doing it again. And this is the current form, but it's super important that we stay on that current form.
Well, and to add something for that Gary had stated, you should let the vendors know too, that whatever we agree to on those changes to the document, we will absolutely agree to them again, right? So they don't have to reinvent the wheel either. When we're making the updated changes, it is more than likely because the business team has come to us and said, hey, after doing this now for a while, this really doesn't make sense. We want to change it operationally. That's one issue. The other issue, as Gary mentioned, is the required corporate changes that are coming down from, for example, our ethics and compliance team. So 2 years ago, we didn't have the requirement to include anti-modern slavery in our contracts. We do now. And so just as a prime example, the LATAM team, your counterparts in LATAM, they're going through an ethics and compliant audit, and they are going through all of their major design, build, and construction agreements. They're taking note of when that agreement got put in place and what happened if there weren't the required E&C, anti-bribery, OFAC, anti-modern slavery, these things that all contracts for Google must have. So when you ask us, can I just extend it? You can, but we've got to update it. And we will make it very clear in the exhibit that anything they were given, they'll be given again. What I don't want the vendors to do is think, I get a second bite at the apple. Now I want to renegotiate everything that they told me no, but now that I'm reinventing the wheel, I want to negotiate again. I want a limitation of liability. I want a cap on my indemnity. All those things we're saying is no, you'll get what you've gotten previously. We're just updating it for terms that are a requirement. And if the vendor has an issue updating their agreement for anti-modern slavery, there's a red flag right there, right? So we just need to make sure we're aware of what is the rationale for them not having some issues with what we're updating it for. But this isn't a reinvent. We don't get to take another bite at the apple and then renegotiate every term.
So I think we're going to open it up to some questions. So everything from process to, not turn to Roland Shee, but
This is the end of the session, so it's opened up to questions throughout the past hour and a half. So don't hold back if there was something from 30 minutes ago as well.
Nobody has any questions for us? Or issues, if you guys have had anything that's been frustrating? Things that you want to raise, like could we consider something? And then could we have you either come up to the, and then we'll pass it depending on who's going to respond.
So how are we capturing lessons learnt from, where we've got issues with master service agreements and implementing those changes into future agreements? Yep. And then I guess, are we, should we flag these things up to the legal team, or is there?
Now, is that so the boots on the ground team, you guys understand, so you see the evolution of why these changes were made? It's helpful for you to then, when you're on the first line, to then make those communication to the vendor first.
I also think where we are today is a culmination of lessons learned. Just the processes and what we've established is heavily leveraging, just the scale of our program to date and things that just weren't working for us to be able to develop at the scale that we're planning to. But it's a really great point that from here on out, we need to create a lessons learned approach. And I think the legal team is capturing that by having very specific cadences for releasing updates to their contracts. So it's not like every single update gets released in a new MSA, but it's at 6-month, 1-year increments to update. And then on our end, we can do the same with a specific cadence of updates as well.
And specifically, we keep track of, we see every contract gets negotiated. So we see every argument and every nuance to every argument. So there's not a paragraph in your documents we haven't seen. we keep track. This group stays in constant contact on, because we may say, wow, that's actually, we need to make that to a form versus that's unique to a vendor. So the one thing that I would encourage that on a lessons learned, which is when projects are done, to do a training session within DevCo to say, okay, how was it used? And I'll use a perfect example because I had 2 conversations on this today. How liquidated damages are used, and how they can be used against you as by a contractor to basically say, I don't want to, I'd rather take the risk of liquidated damages and pay the money to accelerate my schedule. That's a real issue with respect to liquidated damages. And when you're doing ground up construction, that is a conversation that needs to happen every time. We happen to have it with the project teams. Kathy and I had that on our project, talking to Josh about that on his project. Chris and I are in the middle of talking about that on our project. Sally and the legal team always sees that, but in terms of the training and learning, a lessons learned as you complete a project is a terrific training tool idea.
So
At the legal level, we
yeah,
keep
I
track.
mean, given that, I guess, a few of the projects that we're working on, they last a few years. So I guess, waiting to the end, it might just be too long, especially with the
Great
sheer
question.
number of projects that we've not got online yet, but they are, coming through the pipeline. So, is it something that we should have regular sort of, feedback sessions that we provide those lessons learned that we've currently got?
Yeah, I think
on our
that's a great point
projects?
that we can take in. Right now, to date, they've been pretty ad hoc. For instance, the example of, wouldn't it be nice to have a contract attached to the RFP when we go out for RFP? So there's 2 instances of that we're implementing that for. So the GC RFP that we're in the process of, and then also early stages of the design agreement with other Starkitects. We're preparing in early stages of preparing the master service agreement specifically for design firms. And then the legal team is supporting us on that. And then with Josh and Kevin Antonelli as the point for the GC one. So it's been ad hoc. And I think having those regular debriefs, perhaps at major milestones, would be really beneficial, potentially EGMP and GMP and closeout.
For sure. Okay,
Yeah.
cool.
But I would look to the TNT program team to help us
For sure.
establish
Will do,
that.
Yeah. So
And
I'm
we've
noticing-
developed a lessons learned portal, but it's been specific to a varying range of activities. So
Okay, yeah, because we're always getting, I guess, new different things which pop up on our projects.
yeah.
On the Trust News project specifically, especially now that we're in the CA phase. So there's a lot of sort of lessons learned, things that we probably would have liked in the contract that either weren't there. It may not be there for specific reasons because it was negotiated either into or out of the contract. But yeah, definitely be good to get a few of those lessons
Great.
learned. passed
We
through.
would love to hear
Yeah.
those too. And we've had those discussions, particularly on Charleston East, which has had, excuse me, we've had some of those as follow-up on Charleston East because it's further along and it's had, but those are always healthy for everyone to see because what the problem solving is there a tweak in the language that's changed because of that? How can someone misuse a paragraph that's intended to say one thing? You read it and you go, well, of course, that's what it says, and they're misusing it. And you go, okay, well, then I'm going to add the word proviso.
Cool, awesome, thanks.
Sure.
Josh. Just to follow up, Gary, on the training part of it. One thing I think would be good is, first of all, thank you guys. This has been very helpful.
Okay.
And for the rate of growth that we have in terms of new people coming in, there's HR things like, managing within the law at Google, stuff like that. There's online tutorials that you may want to think about the next step of having that online process to give people reviews of what contracting really requirements are within DevCo. And also, Sally, I just want to know, what are we seeing in terms of implications to the model design build for for DevCo as we contract?
Well, it sounds like in our discussions with Joe that more than likely what you guys will be doing is either a modified design build, a true design build, and we may loop in the DevCo team as we work on new acquisitions or ground leases where we would do a reverse build to suit. So that will be a combination working with the transaction management team. I see Kathy and Jeff going, what? Where we're either in the process of negotiating a purchase and sale agreement or a long-term lease or ground lease, where there is a build component to it by the seller/developer. But we may need you guys involved depending on the scale, the scope, and the expanse, and if it sits within your district. So then there's a perfect storm of needing DevCo and the transaction management team, including maybe Sue's team too, depending on how they're going to do the build up. But I understand that you guys are really partnering now from the core and shell versus the interior fit out and working with folks on Sue's team, which is great. Yeah. But Jeff, let me know if I answered your question directly. Okay.
There. Okay, I'm gonna ask Sally. So Sally, what do you think about the use of limited notices to proceed before there's firm pricing? Any issues ever come up?
Are all of you familiar with that term? Limited notice to proceed. Have all of you heard that?
You guys heard that phrase? So one thing I leaned over to Gary about was that limited notice to proceed sort of came out of necessity and on the fly because of I'm going to call it a drop the ball in the contracting perspective, with being under the gun on schedule, the team wanting to go ahead and kick off the GC to start work, and there is no contract in place. And then
Well, there wasn't a GMP in place.
Right. So no contract whatsoever, but the GC is working. And then suddenly the GC wants to get paid. But when they try and run it through the pivot, there's no contract. And suddenly everyone comes screaming at legal saying, help me fix this. So going back to the slide that Derek said, engaging a vendor to do work, having the vendor do work without a contract in place is really, really bad. And there is a time, for those of you like Jeff Curry, where we've been here 13 plus years, there was a time in Crittenden where there was no contract in place. There was an actual significant instance where a subcontractor, the service elevator, fell 3 floors, and the sub who was in there was severely injured to the point that they became disabled, and we had no contract in place. And that is at the time, it was a ground lease with the city of Mountain View. So we didn't even own the site. It then created a revamp, honestly, of how the team was actually allowed to sort of engage and start doing work. It's always when something terrible happens that everything comes to a screeching halt, people lose their jobs, and then things get put into place. What we're going to avoid, hopefully, with the DevCo team, given the size and the scope, is we want to make sure everyone understands that doing this LNTP process, it's there, but for DevCo, more than likely, you guys shouldn't be using it. We should know when you're working through your schematic design phase, once you get to 100% SD, you'll see in the slide, it was a little bit, it departed from a meeting and a conversation with Joe Vivi on how he expected going forward the contracting process for DevCo. So just so you know, it's very unique that at 100% SDs, Joe initially wanted to have a set sort of firm fixed price that then rolls into a GMP. Very unusual. 100% SD, firm fixed price, GMP set. That's not what the slide showed, which kind of made me think, oh crap. But we're going to make we're going to fine tune the slide so there isn't confusion once we roll it out to the team, and it sort of doesn't comport with conversations that we've had with Joe on the contracting side. So we just want to make sure, but again, it's very different. It's not something that we've done on the TI side. Not a bad idea, and something we can do. So it's just something to keep in mind. just engage legal, fill out your intake questions as soon as you can with as much information as you can, and then we can have some robust dialogue.
Another topic no one's raised is IP. In your MSAs, we are very, very tough on any changes to IP. So when you engage new architects, new engineers, and that is something, just to let you know upfront, we are very protective of. A lot of problems can happen. You're paying for a professional to work with you to prepare a design. And we have had, let's just say that that design is something that you should own because you paid for it. And its use outside of a Google project is something that we are very, we at least legally should be protected from, and then we can decide what we should do for it. But that's something I just want to highlight because MSAs come up. They will often, for example, there's a little phrase that sounds innocuous, but they'll say, upon payment in full, I will transfer the IP. Okay? Doesn't sound on its surface, gee whiz, that's kind of, I got to pay him for it. The answer is no, because we actually own the IP. You actually have a separate contract right against us to sue us for the payment, but I own the IP. And we've got, with every single one of these provisions, one of the reasons that when I mentioned risk allocation, contracts in large part are historical documents that are, the words are triggered by something that has occurred on another project. So back to the question of lessons learned, this contract a year from now, after these develop ground up projects, will have different provisions in it than it has today. And that's a learning process that we hope that we engage with you all to educate us. And I've done this with Katie and TNT and others where they're administering and they go, well, wait a minute, Hathaway's viewed this provision like this. We go, well, that's not how it's intended. And so we want to get that feedback so that we can always be mindful of that. Keep strategic sourcing in mind, how we're doing that. And the other thing I would add, which is just on my list, with insurance, Rich isn't here, or I don't know if anybody from his team is here, but they will be the keeper. We will pass those questions on, as Derek said, with either questions or recommendations, but that's a critical path item because they are also thinly staffed. So give them time because we do need their feedback if there's any changes on builders risk, deductible, insurance deductibles, any of that. So that's important.
To add to Gary's IP comment, give Google the right to then go after whether it is the architect or the starchitect, because there's a stadium now that looks just like Charleston East, and there's a hotel that looks just like Caribbean. But it was made at the executive management decision not to send out a notice or a demand with a particular starchitect. But give us the right, let us notice executive management. It may, from a precedent setting, not be great facts. If suddenly that same starchitect with another project that someone else is working on, maybe that's the straw that breaks the camel's back. Because we have allowed them another 2 projects per our contract, it may not have great precedence for us, but at least in our contracts, we are in the right and we could send a notice right away. But just let's make sure that we always own our design, our IP, so that when Larry, Sergey, Dave, Mark, when they take umbrage to something that we paid an incredible amount of money for and actually helped institute, whether it's mass timber, whatever the case may be, make sure we have the right to then go back and say, you don't get to leverage off of what we just did and paid through the nose for, and now you're selling it to pick your next multi-billion-dollar company to do again. So just food for thought.
And just to be clear, we're not asking you guys to go contact these architects. Let your development executive district lead know, and they'll escalate it to legal.
Can you cover the use of images on the project? With that?
So Jeff asked a hot button topic. So architects and the GCs, what we don't like to do, and this is something by the founders, is, and I don't think it's an unreasonable request, we don't want vendors using Google's name to then generate more business. Like, for example, can I put Google on my website that I do all their interior design work? What will happen more than likely is a smaller company, someone else will be like, well, if they've done Google's interior, they can do mine. Maybe as long as I can negotiate a smaller price. An architect should work, or a vendor to us, shouldn't be using our name to get more business. Now, what we've done in the past using our PR team, internal and external, as well as GR, depending on if they're needed, we can get approval depending on what it is they want to take photos of or how they want to elicit us in an RFP. We get asked that on a one-off. Hey, Sally, this vendor, they're very big on this. Can they include this in their RFP? Then we loop in the PR team to make sure. So at least the vendor understands what their rights are with respect to noticing and using Google's name in a release on their website, taking photos. The same thing, anecdotally, we had a vendor who came into the team and said, I'm going to be in this very cool, flashy spread on this very well-known publication, nationwide publication. We thought it's probably going to be fine. But the reality is, at that point, when it got escalated up to Sergey, I believe it was Sergey, not Larry, they had a very specific question, which was, what are the ads that are going to be flanking this article in this magazine? And what are some of the articles that are going to be around our article? And based on that, there were going to be some competitors that were going to have ads close to our article. They said, absolutely not. You cannot reference us. You cannot include pictures of us, nothing. So it kind of came as a surprise, not only to legal, but even to the business team, that our founders were that particular about where this article would be placed in this nationally recognized publication, magazine publication, that they said no. So again, our contracts are the way they are because of the very specific requirements that have been flown down to legal. And so give us the right to have that. And then on a one-off basis, we can seek the approvals from different folks to ensure that what they need is approved and it's fine. But we can't just grant it outright in our agreements.
Another part of that one, Sally, is social media. So an incident where a friend of an architect came to the site, flagged it, said, oh, I visited Google and they have images on their social media broadcast of our project.
So Jeff had a really interesting comment about social media and when you're having not only a contracted party, but maybe an invitee. So if you're going to have an invitee come to a site, you've got to make sure that the invitee, whether it's a company or an individual, has signed an NDA. You also have to be aware when you're doing a site walk, if they're taking a ton of photos, you need to make sure that they're aware, hey, great that you want to take photos, but just know you can't publish them. They can't be, you're under a non-disclosure agreement. And so, the photos that they take aren't necessarily part of it, but we'd want to just remind them that you are part of an NDA. So it does become really important when you guys do the Go NDA search under SIMBA. You also have to look to see that, yes, you'll see a bunch of names under the NDA, but when you actually click on the latest one, if let's say Chris did one for Charleston East for this vendor 4 years ago, Chris may have been very specific when he did the NDA, and it was a project level NDA. So he specifically stated what the discussions would entail. So the fact that there's an NDA with ABC Company that was done 4 years ago, the NDA may not be valid for the Landings project because Chris was very prescriptive on the discussions that the NDA would cover. So make sure that you're paying attention to the entity name, as Chi mentioned, the entity name, whether they're licensed, that's all really important because we have spent time where someone's like, oh, I just realized we had the wrong entity name. We've been contracting with them for 2 years. And now with this new project, we just realized that's not their real name. It's very interesting, the things that come up, and we're here to help, right, and fix. It just, these little things that take time later, these things could all be sort of taken care of in the very, very beginning if there was a little bit more diligence paid in the upfront. But thank you, Jeff.
Any other questions? Yeah, you. Let's see.
I'm just sitting here and listening and trying to think of. Yeah. So I just want to see if there's a way. I mean, I think we are fortunate enough to be working for Google for a long time and for multiple projects. And one thing that we're doing internally is to make sure that what we learn on one project we share real time, not at the end of the project, but real time on other projects. And as you know, to your point, Ro, you're mentioning to develop at this scale for the next few years. Is there a way, is there a forum that we can set up such that we could actually get lessons learned across development managers, across project teams that, for example, you were talking about certain architect contracts. And, for one that we negotiated about what happens if there's a pause or suspension, that is a very important point that should get incorporated across. And I think we're depending on Gary's team to make sure that gets reflected. But again, given the scale of development and given the pace, is there a way to set up? I mean, it's a question whether you guys would consider something so that we could learn
Yeah,
real
we've
time.
discussed this quite in depth, and we're looking at surveys are one way to capture those real time. But what we've identified is there's more value in getting people in a forum together to discuss the issue, not just collecting data and disseminating it. That's part of it, but it's really getting the nuanced contextual information that is outside of the data point itself. So we can work on figuring out like what's that right cadence, whether it's collecting data on a weekly basis that then we look at a quarterly lessons learned forum that we discuss everything from legal to design to execution and construction. Thank you.
Yeah, what you raised is really important, because that example that you raised, when there is a suspension to a project and there's an architect, right? In a particular instance that had happened on Charleston East, we actually almost went into litigation. And so what happened with this one particular architect who no longer does work with Google any longer, at least from the legal side, right? We're having very bifurcated, silo discussions on how to fix them going forward. We're not really sharing it back with the larger team at hand. And I think if we were to do something, a quarterly sync as needed, and the parties can talk about what is it that we want to raise so people understand, because that issue that we had with a designer, not a US entity, it escalated all the way up to Dave, and Dave was having some very heated discussions with the actual owner of, for those of you that know what I'm talking about, it's Ingenhoven. And we actually had to pay them more money to settle, so that it was a business decision, which is fine. But at the end of the day, it really sort of formulated how we are very much fine tuning some of the language in our design, in our master design agreements with architects and architects, so that this doesn't bite us in the butt again. And we're putting in our GC agreements for DevCo too. So when there is a suspension, there is a stop in work, we need to make sure that we're not going to have 10, 20, 30 vendors coming at us saying, pay me, pay me, pay me, unless that's how we decided in the agreement. So as Gary mentioned, when we thought the language was very plain and the legal, we're realizing that there is wiggle room, and people will absolutely, as unreasonable as it is and absolutely ridiculous, they will make those claims because we're kind of litigious.
Yeah, so just one more thought on that. I think, for example, a quarterly update would be great, where there's just a forum for us to share lessons learned real time. Like, for example, last November when we had the smoke where it caused inclement weather impacts. And then, I mean, it certainly affected Bayview and Charleston East. And there was a little bit of coordinating of, well, Charleston East treated it this way, and we treat it this way, and then it took some coordination to be on the same page. And I'm just thinking ahead when we're going to have 5 projects under construction and all of us are hit with the same kind of, hopefully not again, but that would be really helpful to say, here's Google's stance, here's how we're dealing with it, and that's how we're treating it across the board.
It's a great suggestion. Well, with that, I think that's a wrap. I want to first off thank the legal team for taking time today and joining us. Thank you. I also really want to thank Matt, Katie, and Chi on my team for creating this incredible deck and working so closely. So thank you. And then last but surely not least, thank you guys for taking the few hours out of your time. I know that's a huge ask, so we really appreciate it and look forward to feedback and more of these in the future. Thank you.